Hello, hello again, everyone. Thank you for tuning in if you're here. If not, thank you for watching at a later time. Tonight, I'm going to be looking at sculpting on this Tiger Stripe Wolverine here. So I'll give it a few minutes and see if some people jump on before I start yammering to myself, but that's what I'm going to be doing tonight. All right, so I'll just go ahead and get started on a lot of the tools that I use for this. Thanks for jumping on, guys. So again, I'm going to be sculpting some of the tiger stripe stuff on this guy tonight. Last time, or I guess since the last time I worked, I did a little bit of sculpting on this one, which is again going to be the brown costume Wolverine, which is going to be for me. So I think last time I did a live stream, I had installed the neck on this guy. We looked at doing the hands, adding a pivot joint to the hands. So since then, I've just started adding some sculpt to kind of blend these pieces together. So sculpted a bit of the neck here. I'll probably end up coming back and refining this a bit and sanding it down and smoothing it out a little bit. But so far, it's not bad. And I covered up all the peg holes, which also need sanding down. And then on the boots, I covered up the peg holes there. And then I accentuated these fins a little bit more to give them a bit more flair. So, and for these two different things, for the neck, because it's going to be a rigid, solid thing that's not going to move, that's what I typically use stuff like Aves. This is Epoxy Sculpt, and I also have Fix-It Sculpt. They're basically the same thing, except the Fix-It Sculpt gives you a little bit longer working time. So if I'm ever doing something a little bigger, I'll use the Fix-It. So for this is the Aves right here. You mix the two parts together equally, spread it around there, blend those two pieces together. For anything that I think is going to move or that needs to be a little more tacky, I like to use Procreate. And the reason for that is it gives you a bit more grip around any type of joints, and it's also a little flexible. You can see that when it cures. And depending on the mixture, so here's a little pamphlet they give you. Whether or not you do 40-60, 50-50, or 60-40, it's going to give you a softer, even, and a harder final cure. So I usually do the 40-60. So when I sculpt something like this that's kind of protruding out, I know if I use Aves, it would work, but then there's always the chance that you bend the leg wrong or the figure falls off a shelf and then that thing breaks off. With this, that's not going to break off unless you really wrench on it. So, and then you also might notice that this one, it's a little funky looking. This is kind of the massing that I do. Because there's a limited time to work with this stuff, and I'm super picky, I usually will take way too long. So I just kind of mass it on there, and then later come back and sand it out, refine it, trim it with an X-Acto, and get the nice sharp details that I want. I'm taking a little sip of scotch. So I'm not going to do that tonight on this guy. Yeah, I know, I take forever. I was gone for a week though, so I have an excuse. So I'm not going to work on this guy. I'm going to work a little bit on this guy tonight. I've already covered up some of the peg joints. But tonight I'm just going to focus on adding some of these stripes here. And if I have time, maybe I'll do some blending around the neck. So first, I take the aves. Again, this is going to be a spot that's, I don't have to worry about it bending or breaking or snapping off, so I'm just going to do it right on here. I am going to have some issues with keeping this articulation how it is, so I got to make sure to keep this really thin. And there's also a little bit of patchwork I got to do there, so I'll probably fill that in first. Oh, and also, if you can focus on that, I sculpted the little belt for the classic brown Wolverine. All right, so I roll up my aves. I've let this sit for about 15 minutes. I think the instructions say you can let it sit for like 45 minutes if you want a little more firmer workability, but like I said, I'm pretty picky, so I like to get as much working time out of it as possible. And then this mat here is just a silicone baking sheet. One tip is that if you use this for sculpting, don't use it for baking. I learned that the hard way. I thought, oh, I'll just wash it off. It'll be fine. And then things started smoking and smelling really funky, so. All right, so since I'm looking to create a nice thin tiger stripes here, I'm just gonna flatten this out a bit. And because this is a silicone mat, it won't stick. So fold it over. I have my little mini rolling pin here. I'm just gonna roll it out. And that may look pretty thin, but then when you get that on a 4-inch scale figure, it still will end up being really bulky. And it's a little deceiving because the ends or the edges of this are always a little bit thinner than what the center is. And basically I'm going to be laying this over the figure, blending it into the form of the musculature and everything, and then coming back and trimming out the shape I want. Rather than trying to like cut a perfect little football wedge tiger stripe thing to try to create these things and then lay it on the figure, I'm going to just lay a big mat down and cut it out from there. And hopefully that all goes as planned. Another reason I don't like to wait too long to start working with this is it does become easier to work with if you wait about 45 minutes, but it loses some of its tackiness. And then it's harder to get to stick onto the figure. Yeah, it's either going to be 3 separate stripes or kind of a weird zigzaggy thing like that. I think I'll try to touch them in the middle. So this one, the sculpt is weird on this, but so it'll come out, come out, come out. It's kind of like a Christmas tree. You haven't missed much, Paul. I just went over some of the stuff I did to the brown suit version that I'm doing, and some of the little fins I sculpted. So now I'm just laying this on here. So what I like to do once I get that on there, rather than starting mushing it around with my finger and stretching it all out, I just take a paintbrush. These are some really cheap, crummy ones that I don't mind getting messed up. And I just start gently kind of brushing it over the figure. And you can see it really helps form to the shape of the figure. So what I may do is just try to do that top stripe first. If I can do... So this is my sculpting X-Acto knife. As you can see, there's putty and all kinds of junk caked on it. I keep that separate from the X-Acto I use for trimming and sanding and you know, fine cutting. But I use this a lot when I'm sculpting. It gives you a nice clean, sharp edge. You can get in areas that you can't normally get in with other sculpting tools, but I use this quite a bit. So I'm just kind of using this guy as a reference. May not be the best reference, but since I'm using my phone for the camera, I can't use my phone to look up pictures right now. Looks like it comes right up under his armpit. And around the back, and this one it kind of forms to that upper torso piece, which is nice for blending the sculpt in with the articulation. So I was going to fill that little gap in, but maybe I don't need to. So you can kind of see it looked really thin when I rolled it out, but now that it's on the figure, it starts to look a little bulky and just out of scale. If you think of this like it's just a patch or something that's sewn onto his costume, it's going to be really thin. So if that happens, I'll do this. I'll peel it off. Roll it out a bit again. Now that it's off here, I'm just going to go ahead and fill this up. So here I just have a jar of water, plain old water with a bunch of crap in it. I primarily use just tap water for smoothing out the sculpt. And then when I'm ready to finish it off and finish any, smooth out any textures or any fine lines, that's when I'll switch to the Aves safety solvent. Not really sure what this is. It's kind of like a alcohol-based something or other. But I find if you start with this, it makes the Aves really soft. And then if you want to come back and try to tool something, at that point it's kind of a lost cause and it smushes everywhere. Obviously now it's bigger than I need it to be, but that's fine because I can just trim it back down. Again, just using that brush to get it to form to the figure as tightly as possible. If I miss any comments, I'm sorry. It's my first time really sculpting with a camera on. Because normally I have this thing like 2 inches from my face. So if it turns out shitty, that's my excuse. So I'm just carefully trimming away. I don't want to trim away too much because it's harder to add stuff back than it is to cut it away. One little trick I have too to keep my tools clean while I'm working, I'll just stick a little dab on the back of my thumb. And then whenever I cut a piece off, rather than trying to flick it off, you can just dab it on there and it sticks. I'll do my best. So it looks a little lopsided right now, but once I get the other ones on, maybe it'll be okay. And if I do any texturing or, you know, tiny little stitch work or something like that, I'll always save that for last. So because the torso is so squatty here, I might not be able to get both stripes on there, or both little zigzags. This one, this shitty figure, his kind of just blends in with the belt a little bit. It's almost like you get two zigs, no zag. So let's see what I can do here. And this, if anyone's wondering, is just a piece of irrigation pipe. Because I didn't want to spend $15 on one of the official little acrylic rollers. Hello, Helio. Another thing you can do rather than rolling it out twice is just gently kind of tug on the ends. It's like a little mini pizza. If anyone's ever worked at a pizza shop, when you throw the dough, you roll it, but then you get most of the shape and size of the pizza just by working it with your hands. Just kind of cutting the shape of the upper torso a little bit. I know this isn't the most exhilarating thing to watch, so I appreciate you guys sticking around. If you got any questions, just let me know. So I'll just cut away any excess to get myself a better idea of what I'm working with here. I appreciate that. It's relaxing for me too, so I'm glad. It's one of the challenges of working with action figures as opposed to just sculpting a statue or something like that, is you have to really work with the articulation, not only to avoid paint rub and all that typical stuff, but just getting it to work. As you can see, it can be a giant pain in the ass. So I think what I'm going to do is do like 1.5 stripes here, maybe. Let's try this out. If I end up not liking it, then you can always chip this off and start over. So it's kind of looking okay. I don't know. You guys tell me. I mean, it looks like shit, but the general shape. Sorry, this is usually the point in which I just kind of zone out and just keep picking away at it, little by little. This is why it takes me so damn long to make these things. That and procrastination and video games and a wife and kids and all that other fun stuff. So this is another tool I use quite a bit, and it's just, these are dental tools. I think I bought them as wax sculpting tools on Amazon, but they're basically dental tools, cheap dental tools, because real ones are some ridiculous price. I guess they gotta be super nice if they're cramming them in people's mouths. But this is just a really fine point, like a little hook needle, the same thing on that side. And this one used to actually be a little bit finer, but the very, very tip of it snapped off. But I use this one quite a bit. I don't like how that's kind of going into the armpit there, so. So I'm just using the edge of the blade to kind of flatten it out a bit and tuck, so it tucks up underneath the upper torso. Another tool I use a lot is this one. It's got two flat little like iron shaped pieces, and these are good for just smoothing out areas, or you know, defining like hairlines or wrinkles in fabric, things like that. I think what I'm going to do is cut them in even deeper so they have more of that zigzag effect. All right, so I mean that's pretty good. And the good thing about using both these products, and like I said before, a lot of times you can just mask something out, like I did for this here. I just kind of masked out the fins. It's not super smooth, it's not totally even, but then you can come back with some sanding files and an X-Acto knife and just kind of trim away, and you can start to get like really sharp lines and things like that. So you can do the same thing with Aves. It's what I do for a lot of like weapons and things like that. I'll never try to sculpt something to be 100% perfect with this kind of stuff. It just, for me personally, doesn't have quite the properties that a real sculpting clay does. Um, so it doesn't really lend itself to a lot of like really minor tweaking. I'm also not, professional sculptor or anything too, so there's probably people out here that can work magic with this stuff, but for me, it's better to get it pretty close to how I want it, and then once it's cured, come back, smooth it out, clean up the edges, adjust any proportions, things like that. So I think that's okay. It looks good from the front, looks okay from the back. So rather than you guys sit here and watch me mess with this forever, I'll just go ahead and add some detail around the edges. So I always try to cram as much detail, especially in these smaller figures. I want to make them, I don't want to hold back on the detail just because they're smaller figures. So I'm going to try to get some very subtle little like pinstriping kind of stitching along the edges of this thing. So this is a good tool for that. I also used to have just a needle that I used for a bunch of stuff, but that broke, and then I got these. So I'm just gently pressing in along the edge, trying to keep a consistent line. And then I don't want it to be a perfectly clean line, because like I said, I want it to kind of look like stitching. And the good part about adding small details like this, especially on these tiny figures, is when you start applying paints, these tiny little crevices and stuff like that are where your washes and dry brushing and stuff like that really is gonna make things pop. So it may not look like much now, but then once you get a nice dark wash in there, it's gonna look cool. I'm going to add a bit more in there, so if this figure's posed to the side, it's still a complete stripe, even though it doesn't line up. And I'm not trying to get the perfect shape when I push it in there because it's so small that would just be a nightmare to do. So I'm just trying to get enough in there so that I can cut back away and create that clean edge. So I am not going to push this back because I'm afraid it's going to smush that up. But what that tells me is that it's still too thick if it's doing that. So I'm going to wait for it to cure. I'll go ahead and put the little stitching in, but then I'll come back when it's cured and sand it down a bit and get it as thin as possible. And then if I have to, I'll carve in the stitching with an X-Acto if the sanding, wipes out all the detail. I also want this to look like it's getting kind of tucked in to the belt. So I want to emphasize that fold there a little bit. So any like little flashing and stuff that gets caught in there, that's going to be cleaned up mostly in my final step, which I'll get to in a second. All right, so let's add the detailing. Sorry, I keep hitting me. Thanks, dude. I appreciate that. I guess since I get paid for it, maybe I'm technically a professional. It does make me wish I took some sculpting classes in college. Took regular art, but we never got into sculpting. All right, so one last one. I'll just do the top on this one. So you can even like create a little bit of a fold there. Like it's kind of getting tucked and twisted next to the belt. So that's pretty good. It's not too bulky. If I think it is later, again, I'll just sand it down a little bit. All right, so the final step, I take the Aves safety solvent when I'm happy with what I got. And I'm almost out of this stuff, and this stuff is not cheap. So I use it very sparingly. I just give myself a drop. And I take that same brush. I've been using it dry this whole time, just to, again, conform it to the shape of the figure. So I'll just saturate that, it soaks it all up, and then I'll just start brushing over it. So this is going to get rid of any major imperfections or flashing or any little crumbs that stick around the edges. If you do this too much, it'll just make the whole thing kind of a muddy mess. And one trick I actually learned on accident, and I used it on the Agent Venom I made, the 3 3/4 inch one I made, which was like the second or third figure I ever made. So I figured this out on accident. If you actually use the Aves solvent and get it to a point where it's kind of a mushy mess, and then come back over it with regular tap water, it'll actually bead up. I don't want to do it here, but it'll actually start to bead up and kind of create these little like mushy crumbs. And I used it on that Agent Venom to give his armor like a kind of a rough texture to it that looked different than you know, his regular under armor undercoat. So you can play around with that and see what works for you. Another thing to note with this stuff, for whatever reason, it dissolves paint. So you probably can't tell on camera, but there's a little bit of red showing up, and that's because I used it to smooth out the neck on this guy. So it was actually dissolving the paint on this. So if you're ever sculpting over something that next to, you know, a final painted piece and you don't want to mess that up, just keep that in mind. All right, so that's about it. 46 minutes. You can see this is a fairly simple detail to add, but you can just kind of see how long it takes. Of course, I blabbed for about 20 of those minutes, but nevertheless, even small things like this take a lot of time. So I'll go ahead and you know, add the other stripe on the other side. I don't want to mess with it too much now because I get real clumsy and I get overly concentrated. I'll end up putting a finger in there and destroying what I just did. So I try to work on other body parts and, you know, do one part of the figure at a time. But if there's any last minute questions,